What is our earliest source for Jesus? Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and part of Paths in Biblical Studies. And our earliest evidence for Jesus is actually the letters of Paul. Now, Paul admits that he didn't know the what we might call historical Jesus and never met him during his lifetime. In fact, he tells us that at a certain point he pursued or persecuted what we might call early Christians, so members of this Christ group. But in his letters, he indicates two things that are essential. The first is that he has spoken to people who knew the historical Jesus, who were part of that original following, including James, Jesus' brother, and Peter. And so he doesn't even often get along with these guys, but he admits that he knows them and that he has to interact with them and deal with them because they are also a centerpiece of the continuing Christ movement. And as I'm sure many of you know, they basically come to a detente of a sort where Peter and James seem to still see the movement as pretty much a Jewish movement of some kind, whereas Paul sees it as a movement that is supposed to incorporate Gentiles. This is part of his role as a Pharisee. He interprets Hebrew scripture and he understands that a certain number of Gentiles should be brought into the fold. And you can see through letters like Galatians where people like Peter, James, and Paul are ironing out the details of how this movement will go forward. Now, that's the first piece. Paul talks about these people. They knew Jesus. They are part of a continuing movement for which Jesus was at the center or in a place of leadership. So that's very, very helpful for us to understand the trajectory of this social movement. But the other thing Paul talks about, which is a little bit different, is his experiences of the risen Christ. Now, anybody who's familiar with Paul's backstory will know that he has a vision of the resurrected Jesus, of the risen Christ. And it's that experience that tells him he's wrong, that Jesus is, in fact, the Jewish Messiah, the predicted Jewish Messiah. And he changes his life because of this. But then he continues to have these kinds of experiences where we might even call them divination experiences. He has some kind of interaction somehow with the risen Christ. Sometimes in his letters, he'll use the phrase by way of the Lord. So he'll get some information by way of the Lord. For example, his description of what we call the Last Supper is by way of the Lord. It seems as though he's actually having some kind of divination experience of the risen Christ that's telling him this information. Now, what's interesting about that is, should we distinguish between information about the historical Jesus and the information that Paul is receiving, he believes, from the resurrected Christ? That's an open question. But either way, when we look at Paul's letters, we have our earliest evidence of those social dynamics, of that group formation, and the earliest stages of what will eventually become Christianity. And then later, of course, we have some Roman historians who will talk about Christianity. They get some details wrong. We also have someone like Josephus, where there's a passage about Jesus and John the Baptist, although the passage about Jesus has some funny business that I'll talk about another time that leaves it in doubt to some degree. And then the Gospels, written sometime after the Jewish War. So you do have later materials, late first century, second century. But if we're looking at the mid first century and the maybe 2 decades following the death of Christ, letters of Paul. If you'd like to know more about any of these subjects, please go to bartehrman.com/BSA Learning. BSA stands for Biblical Studies Academy. There you can access a variety of courses on subjects like Paul and the Gospels, our early Christian sources, and a variety of other subjects. So that's BSA Learning, bartehrman.com/BSA Learning.